4 decorated pilots. 30,000 flight hours combined. 2 hours of failure while a man died in the sky above them. Then a woman nobody asked for stepped in, and needed exactly 60 seconds. What she did wasn't strength. It was something the 4 men never once considered. Watch what happens next. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The command center smelled like burnt wiring, stale coffee, and the sour tang of male panic. It was a windowless concrete bunker buried beneath the Nevada dirt, lit by the flat, unforgiving glare of fluorescent tubes that hummed at a frequency just low enough to give everyone in the room a headache they hadn't noticed yet. At the center of it sat the simulator, a multi-million-dollar hydraulically mounted replica of the X-44 cockpit. Right now, it was a coffin nobody wanted to admit they were building. On the main telemetry screen, a jagged green line traced a merciless descent. 70 miles away, inside the real X-44, Major David Cole was trapped at 38,000 feet. His fly-by-wire system had suffered a cascading, catastrophic lock. The jet had become an aerodynamic brick, caught in a shallow, unrecoverable flat spin, bleeding 1,000 feet of altitude every 60 seconds. Cole couldn't fly it. Worse, he couldn't eject. The explosive charring bolts on the canopy had failed to fire, and pulling the handle now would send the rocket seat straight into an unjettisoned canopy. He would break his neck before the jet ever reached the desert floor. Down in the bunker, 4 of the best pilots the Air Force had were trying to find a manual sequence to reboot the jet's flight computers and restore hydraulic pressure. They had 90 minutes of fuel left before Cole became a smoking crater in the Mojave. They had already spent 2 hours failing. Commander Harrison gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles bone white. "Reset the sim," he barked. "Hayes, get back in there. Try the secondary bus." Major Brent Hayes peeled himself out of the simulator's bucket seat. His flight suit was soaked dark down the spine. He'd flown combat sorties in 2 different wars, and right now his hands were shaking like a rookie's. "I tried the secondary bus," Hayes rasped, wiping sweat off his chin with a blistered glove. "The second I cut main power to cycle it, the pitch compensator maxes out. The computer thinks the jet is inverted. It throws the rudder hard left to correct a roll that isn't happening. I can't outmuscle it, Commander. The stick turns to concrete." "Then why it goes in," Harrison snapped. "Try a -G push. Stall the compressor, starve the engine, force a hard manual restart." Captain Wyatt didn't argue. He climbed into the sim and strapped the heavy harness across his chest. The hydraulic arms of the rig hissed, lifting the cockpit, mirroring the exact telemetry of Cole's dying jet in real time. This was the 3rd pilot to take the seat. Before Wyatt, there had been Hayes, and before Hayes, a lieutenant colonel named Reyes who had flown the X-44 program since its inception and who had walked out of the simulator an hour earlier looking like a man who had aged a decade in 40 minutes. 4 men. 30,000 flight hours between them. Every one of them had beaten their fists against the same locked column and come away with nothing but bruised palms and a growing, unspoken certainty that David Cole was already dead. They just hadn't told him yet. Leaning against the cool cinder block wall at the back of the room, Sarah Miller methodically picked black nail polish off her left thumb. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was a line pilot, a combat veteran pulled off rotation to test weapons integration, nursing a bruised rib from a high-G dogfight exercise 3 days earlier. She'd been sitting in the corner for 2 hours, watching the Air Force's most decorated test pilots brutalize the simulator one after another. She tasted copper at the back of her throat. Acidic coffee churned in her empty stomach. She was exhausted, but her eyes never left the massive screen displaying Cole's telemetry. Over the speakers, Cole's voice crackled, thinner now, the oxygen mix in his mask beginning to run lean. "Groom Lake, this is Ghost 1. 32,000. Controls still locked. Any magic tricks down there?" His voice didn't crack, but it had lost its usual arrogance. It was the quiet, hollow tone of a man doing the math on his own mortality and not liking the answer. "Stand by, Ghost 1, Harrison said into his headset. "Wyatt's in the box. We're working a hard restart sequence." In the simulator, Wyatt was fighting for his life, or at least for the illusion of it. The heavy mechanical clank of the rig echoed through the room as he threw the virtual jet into a dive, yanking the stick back with both hands, boots stomping the rudder pedals. It was violent and desperate and, to anyone watching closely, exactly like what Hayes had done, and exactly like what Reyes had done before him. Sarah stopped picking her nails. She watched the data stream scrolling down the left side of the screen. They're doing it wrong. The thought wasn't a sudden burst of heroic inspiration. It was a dull, irritating realization, the kind you get watching someone shove a pull door over and over, certain that harder is the answer. Wyatt was a textbook pilot. So was Hayes. So was Reyes. All three had spent 2 hours treating the X-44 like a mechanical beast that needed to be tamed. They were applying the physics of a dogfight to what was, underneath all the carbon fiber and classified avionics, a software glitch. They pulled breakers. They fought the stick. They tried to overpower the actuators with sheer force, over and over, the same failure dressed in different flight suits. But the jet wasn't fighting them. The jet was having a panic attack. Sarah had always understood machines better than she understood people. The X-44's flight computer was designed to protect the pilot above all else. Right now its sensors were feeding it contradictory data, airspeed, attitude, and rate of rotation numbers that didn't agree with each other, and it had concluded, in the cold logic of its code, that the aircraft was out of control and the pilot might be incapacitated. So it locked the controls to prevent a panicking human from making things worse. And every time a pilot yanked the stick against that lockout, the computer registered the input as further evidence of exactly the erratic behavior it was designed to override, and clamped down harder. It was a closed loop. A trap built from good intentions. A piercing alarm shrieked through the room. Critical impact flashed in neon red across the main screen. The rig sighed and lowered back to the floor. Wyatt unlatched the canopy and pushed it open. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head and stared at the floor mat, the fourth man in 2 hours to fail in exactly the same way as the men before him. 2 hours, Hayes muttered, pacing in front of the console. We've run every permutation in the manual. We've run permutations outside the manual. It's a closed loop, Commander. The second you try to override the hydraulics, the master alarm triggers a fail-safe, and the fail-safe locks harder. Harrison pressed his palms hard against his face. The room went silent except for the rhythmic, mocking beep of the radar transponder tracking Cole's descent. 30,000 feet, a technician whispered from the server racks. 29. He's got maybe 12 minutes of altitude left before this becomes academic. Harrison swallowed hard and reached for the primary comms switch. He was about to tell David Cole to make his peace. Commander. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the stale, defeated air of the room like a scalpel through gauze. Harrison turned. Hayes stopped pacing. Wyatt looked up from the floor. Sarah pushed off the cinder block wall and walked toward the center of the room. Her flight suit was unzipped to the sternum, revealing a sweat-stained olive drab t-shirt underneath. Her hair had come half loose from its knot. There were dark purple bags under her eyes, and her ribs ached with a dull, insistent throb with every step. She did not look like a savior. She looked like someone who had been awake for far too long and had just decided, quietly and without ceremony, that watching this fail a fifth time was no longer acceptable. You're fighting it, Sarah said, stopping behind Harrison's chair. Hayes let out a short, cynical laugh. No, Miller. It's a locked hydraulic column. What do you suggest, asking it nicely? Sarah didn't look at him. She stared at the telemetry screen. You're treating it like a MiG. Every input you give it is erratic and violent, and the X-44's fly-by-wire is an adaptive learning system. It reads panic as data. Right now it thinks the pilot is incapacitated or the aircraft is compromised, so it's holding the flight envelope protection open no matter what you do. You pull back, it pushes forward to save itself from you. Harrison's brow furrowed. We know the system, Miller. But if we don't break the lockout, he pancakes into the Mojave in under 12 minutes. You can't break it. Sarah's voice was flat, almost bored, the tone of someone reciting an equation rather than making an argument. You have to let it go. Wyatt wiped his face with a towel, his voice dripping exhausted condescension. Let it go. He's in a flat spin, Miller. If he lets go of the stick, he accelerates straight into the ground. If he lets go of the stick and cuts the primary sensor array, the jet goes blind. That's insane, Hayes said, his jaw tightening. You cut the primary sensors mid-spin, you lose artificial horizon, altitude radar, everything. You're flying a 15-ton anvil in pitch black. And even if the locks somehow drop, you can't manually catch a flat spin in the dark. The G-forces alone would. I can, Sarah said. She didn't wait for Harrison's permission. She walked past the cluster of exhausted men and stepped up onto the simulator platform. The leather of the bucket seat was still warm and slick with Wyatt's sweat. It smelled sour, like old pennies and fear. She grimaced faintly and dropped into the seat anyway, reaching up to pull the heavy harness over her shoulders, locking the metal buckle across her sternum with a sharp clack. Miller, step down, Harrison warned, his voice climbing. This isn't the time for. If you cut the sensors and drop his telemetry completely, we lose the feed entirely, Hayes cut in. If he doesn't recover, he dies in the dark and we won't even see it happen. He's dying anyway, Sarah said, muffled now as she slipped the VR helmet over her head. Link my audio to Cole. Miller. Link the damn audio, Harrison. He's at 22,000 feet. Do you want to write the letter to his wife, or do you want to let me work? A long, agonizing second of static filled the room. Then the technician hit the switch. The visor flickered to life around her, plunging Sarah into the digital twin of Cole's nightmare. The sky was violently spinning, blue, brown, over and over with sickening speed. The altimeter shrieked its warning tone. The master caution alarm stabbed at her ears in a relentless rhythm. The virtual flight stick was locked rigid by the simulator's force feedback motors, exactly as real as the one 70 miles away. Ghost 1, this is Miller, she said. Her voice in the headset was remarkably steady, betraying none of the adrenaline now flooding her system. Her bruised rib screamed as she tightened her core, bracing for what was coming. Miller? Cole's voice was ragged, panicked. Where's Harrison? Taking a coffee break. Listen to me, Cole. I need you to do exactly what I do, the exact second I do it. Don't hesitate. Don't think. If you think, you die. The stick is a rock, Miller. I can't move it. Take your hands off the stick, David. Silence on the radio. In the bunker, Hayes took a step toward the console, mouth opening to object. Harrison raised a hand, cutting him off without looking away from Sarah. Take my hands off. Cole whispered. Feet off the rudders, hands in your lap. Sarah did the same in the simulator, sitting completely still inside the violently spinning digital cockpit. It went against every instinct drilled into a pilot from their first day of flight school. When you fall, you fight. You pull. You grip until your knuckles turn white. She forced her hands flat against her thighs instead, and made herself watch the horizon spin. Okay, Cole breathed. Hands are off. On my mark, you reach up to the overhead panel and flip the master sensor bus to off. The jet goes totally dark. Displays die. You'll hear nothing. Wait 2 seconds. Then slam the stick hard right, drop the landing gear, and kick the left rudder. You understand? Drop the gear in a spin. It'll rip the doors off. That's the point. We need asymmetric drag to break the rotation. You ready? She didn't wait for his confirmation. She watched the digital altimeter tick down. 18,000 feet. Mark. In perfect synchronization with the man 70 miles away, Sarah reached up without hesitation and slammed the master sensor toggle down. Inside the simulator, everything died at once. The alarms cut out. The screens went black. The violent mechanical shaking of the rig smoothed into an eerie, sickening freefall. In the command center, the main telemetry screen flatlined. We lost telemetry, the technician shouted. Sarah closed her eyes beneath the dead visor. She didn't need the screens. She could feel the heavy, dead weight of the aircraft in the silence, and she counted in the dark. 1.2. She felt the subtle, almost imperceptible click in the simulator's force feedback system, the computer quietly rebooting its backup gyroscope, buying itself a few seconds of blindness before it reasserted control. The hydraulic lock had disengaged. Sarah moved. She exploded into motion, a blur of muscle memory and precision, no wasted effort anywhere in it. She grabbed the stick and shoved it hard right, ignoring the searing protest from her ribs. Her left boot stomped the rudder pedal to the floor. Her left hand slapped the landing gear lever down. The simulator groaned as its physics engine calculated the sudden, immense drag of gear deploying at speeds it was never designed for. The rig slammed hard to the right, throwing her against her shoulder restraints. She gritted her teeth, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue, and held the stick rigid. Fight the panic. Hold the drag. 10 seconds passed in absolute, agonizing silence in the bunker. No one breathed. Hayes stared at the black telemetry screen like it might come back to life through will alone. Harrison looked like a man watching his own decision play out in real time and unable to do a single thing about it. Inside the sim, Sarah felt the rotation stop. The asymmetric drag had caught the air. The nose dipped, converting the deadly flat spin into a steep but conventional dive, survivable, if barely. Primary bus on. Sarah grunted, slamming the overhead switch back up. The screens flared to life. The alarms screamed back into existence, but the stick had gone fluid in her hands. She pulled back gently now, milking the aerodynamics, feeling the virtual wings bite into the air properly for the first time in 2 hours. The nose rose. The horizon leveled. She pulled the VR helmet off and tossed it onto the empty passenger console, breathing heavily, sweat stinging her eyes. Through the open canopy of the simulator she looked at the main screen. The telemetry feed flickered, then stabilized. Altitude, 8,400 feet. Status, level flight. Hydraulics, nominal. A ragged, heavy breath exploded over the comms, the sound of a man who had just breached the surface of the ocean after nearly drowning. Groom Lake. Cole's voice trembled so hard it distorted the microphone. I have positive control. Gear doors are sheared to hell. But I'm flying. I'm flying. The bunker stayed silent for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the technician at the back let out a sharp, breathless laugh, and the tension in the room broke all at once, men exhaling like they'd been holding it since the first pilot climbed into the box 2 hours earlier. For a moment, nobody in the bunker moved to fill the silence. It was the kind of silence that follows a thing so large no one trusts their own voice to be the first one to speak into it. The technician wiped his palms on his trousers. Hayes stared at the recovered telemetry line as though it might vanish again if he looked away. Wyatt sat down heavily on the edge of the console, elbows on his knees, staring at his own hands like he didn't recognize them. Harrison keyed the comms. Ghost 1, Groom Lake. Confirm status. Positive control, Cole repeated, steadier now, though his voice still shook at the edges. Airspeed's holding. I've got hydraulics on the primary control surfaces. Gears down and locked, what's left of it, anyway. Requesting vectors for an emergency straight in. Copy that, Ghost 1. Vector 310, runway 29er is clear and foamed. Emergency crews are already rolling. Copy, and, Groom Lake. A pause, filled with the faint hiss of altitude and adrenaline. Whoever that was on the override. Tell them I owe them a drink they'll never be able to pay back. Harrison glanced at Sarah, who was already unbuckling. She didn't look up. Sarah didn't celebrate. She unbuckled her harness with trembling fingers, the only outward sign of the adrenaline crash working through her, and pushed herself out of the warm leather seat. Her boots hit the concrete floor with a heavy thud. She walked past Hayes, whose mouth hung slightly open. She walked past Harrison, who was staring at her like she'd just performed a miracle he still didn't fully understand. She picked her chipped nail polish up off the console, slipped it back into her flight suit pocket, and headed for the door. It wasn't impossible, she said quietly, not looking back. You just forgot how to fly. The Nevada sun hit her like a physical blow the second she pushed through the heavy steel blast doors of the command bunker. The air outside was superheated, shimmering over cracked asphalt in violent wavy lines, thick with the smell of baked tar, sagebrush, and the sharp chemical tang of jet fuel. The shock of going from the meat locker chill of the sim to 110-degree afternoon hit her system hard. Her bruised rib, which had been whispering all afternoon, started screaming. Sarah stumbled to the side of the concrete path and leaned against a sun-bleached dumpster, bracing her hands on her knees, dry heaving into the dust. Nothing came up but strings of bitter, acidic saliva. Her whole body vibrated with a violent tremor that started in her calves and worked its way up to her jaw. It was the adrenaline tax, the body's bill for doing the impossible, and it always came due the moment the danger passed and there was nothing left to focus on but the fact that you were still alive. She'd felt this before, though never quite this badly. The first time had been years ago, a mid-air engine flameout over open water during a training exercise, a long silent glide toward a runway that seemed to take an hour and lasted 90 seconds. Back then a flight surgeon had explained it to her in clinical terms, a flood of catecholamines with nowhere left to go once the threat resolved, the body still braced for a fight that had already ended. Knowing the biology didn't make the shaking stop. It never did. It just meant she wasn't surprised by it anymore, and didn't waste energy being frightened of her own hands. She spat into the dirt, wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, and forced herself upright. She breathed in shallow, measured gasps, favoring her left side. Out on the flight line, the emergency sirens were winding down from a frantic wail to a low, rhythmic pulse. 3 yellow crash tenders and a pair of white medical vans sat at the threshold of runway 29er, lights cutting strobes through the heat distortion. Sarah didn't go to the medical vans. She walked toward the hangar aprons instead, found a sliver of shade beneath the wing of a parked transport, and leaned her spine against the corrugated metal siding, hot even through her flight suit. She waited. 5 minutes later, a ragged, tearing sound ripped through the desert sky. It didn't sound like a stealth prototype. It sounded like a piece of heavy farm machinery being shoved off a cliff. The X-44 came in low over the jagged line of distant mountains, its profile ugly and wrong. The portside landing gear door had been sheared entirely off its hinges. Jagged strips of carbon composite armor hung loose from the fuselage, fluttering violently in the slipstream. As it crossed the runway threshold, it wobbled, the pilot fighting the asymmetric drag of a jet that desperately wanted to pull left. The tires slammed onto the concrete with a loud, percussive crack. Puffs of blue smoke exploded from the rear bogies. Cole was standing on the brakes far harder than the manual would ever recommend, and nobody watching was going to blame him for it. A high, agonizing squeal rose across the base as the anti-lock brakes fought the aircraft's momentum. The smell of scorching rubber and burning carbon rolled across the tarmac, thick and acrid. The jet shuddered, swerved slightly toward the scrub at the runway's edge, and finally groaned to a halt 200 yards short of the end of the strip. The crash tenders swarmed it immediately, laying a precautionary blanket of white foam under the engines just in case. Sarah watched from the shade. She didn't move as the ground crew rushed a ladder to the cockpit. The canopy popped open with a hiss of pressurized air, and David Cole climbed out. He didn't look like the arrogant, magazine cover test pilot whose face had been plastered across 3 defense contractor brochures. He looked small. His helmet was off, his flight suit soaked through and plastered to his chest. His legs buckled the moment his boots touched the tarmac, and a pair of ground crewmen had to catch him under the arms to keep him from going down. They sat him on the bumper of a medical truck. A medic pressed an oxygen mask into his hands, but he pushed it away, eyes wide and bloodshot, scanning the crowd of personnel rushing the scene. He saw her. Sarah pushed off the hangar wall and walked slowly across the tarmac, hands in her pockets to hide the lingering tremor in her fingers. The distance between them felt much longer than it was. Cole stood as she approached, brushing off the medic trying to hold him down, walking unsteadily, swaying like a man 3 drinks past sober. They stopped 3 feet apart. The noise of the fire trucks, the shouting mechanics, the whine of cooling turbines, all of it seemed to fade into a dull white static around the two of them. Up close, Cole smelled intensely of stale sweat and vomit. He'd thrown up inside his mask somewhere during the dive. He looked down at her, a foot taller, heavily muscled, the physical ideal the Air Force put on its posters, trembling so violently his teeth audibly clicked together. "You tore my gear doors off," he croaked, his voice raw, shredded by G-forces and screaming. "You're welcome," Sarah said, flat, devoid of warmth. He stared at her, blinking slowly, processing the jagged edges of a reality he was still catching up to. The arrogance was gone. The ego was gone. There was only the naked, shivering realization of a man who had felt the breath of something enormous pass directly over his neck and kept walking. He didn't salute. He didn't offer a crisp, regulation thank you. He simply slumped forward and dropped his forehead onto her shoulder, a heavy, dead weight lean, entirely stripped of dignity. Sarah flinched as the impact jolted her bruised rib, but she gritted her teeth and held her ground, refusing to let him fall. She didn't wrap her arms around him. She didn't pat his back. She just stood there, acting as a structural support for a man who had briefly stopped being one, staring blankly over his shoulder at the smoking, wounded shape of the X-44 sitting under a blanket of foam. "Don't bleed on my flight suit, Cole," she muttered. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I thought I was dead, Miller. God, I was already dead." "Not today," she said quietly. "Now get off me. I need a cigarette." 4 hours later, the adrenaline had burned off entirely, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion that sat behind her eyes like sand. Sarah sat in Commander Harrison's freezing office, the air conditioning drying out her contacts until they felt like paper. Harrison sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, tapping a thick blue-covered manual with 2 fingers, like it might offer him a better explanation than the one he already had. Major Hayes stood in the corner, arms crossed, glaring at the floorboards as though they'd personally wronged him. 3 safety directives, Harrison said, his voice flat and tired. Unapproved manual override, disengaging primary sensors during an active stall, intentional structural damage from deploying gear past maximum operating speed. Sarah shifted in the faux leather chair, which squeaked under her. "The jet's on the tarmac, Commander." The alternative was a 3-mile debris field in the Mojave and a folded flag for Cole's wife. "Which form do you want me to fill out first?" "You threw the dice, Miller," Hayes said, scoffing. If that backup gyro hadn't spun up in time, Cole would have driven himself straight into the dirt with your blessing. She turned her head slowly, eyes tired but steady. "It wasn't luck, Major. It was mechanics. You spent 2 hours fighting the software like it was an enemy. I stopped fighting it and let physics do the rest. You don't negotiate with a failing system. You pull its plug and let gravity do the math it's already trying to do." Harrison raised a hand before Hayes could fire back, and the silence that followed was thick with institutional friction. Survival, it turned out, was rarely clean, and the military ran on predictable checklists built by careful men in quiet rooms. Sarah had stepped outside the matrix those checklists were built from, and that made her a problem, even though, or perhaps especially because, it had also made her right. Harrison pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long breath of bureaucratic fatigue. Lockheed's engineers are already looking at the flight logs. They think you found a genuine back door in the lock logic, something nobody flagged in 4 years of testing. They're patching the sim by tomorrow morning. Do I get a royalty check? You get to keep your wings, Harrison said, though there was the faintest, reluctant edge of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Cole's on mandatory site leave for the next 72 hours. But I want to understand something, Miller. He leaned forward, searching her face like the answer might be written somewhere on it. Hayes has 2,000 hours in that airframe. Reyes helped write the flight manual. Wyatt's the best stick and rudder pilot on this base. Why did you see it, and they didn't? Sarah stood, pressing her hand against her throbbing ribs, and thought for a moment about the absolute, terrifying silence in the simulator the instant she'd cut the power, the specific kind of quiet that only exists in the half-second before you find out whether you were right. Because he trusts the machine, she said. He was waiting for the computer to give him permission to fly. I didn't wait for permission. I just took the controls back the second it gave me an opening, and I didn't ask it whether that was allowed. She didn't wait for dismissal. She turned for the heavy oak door. Miller, Harrison called after her. She paused, hand resting on the brass knob. Good flying. Fix the damn jet, she muttered, letting the door click shut behind her. Outside, the desert heat was finally breaking. The sun dipped below the jagged mountain line, bruising the sky in streaks of violent purple and orange. Sarah pulled a crumpled cigarette from her pocket, lit it, and took a slow, ragged drag. The smoke burned her throat, sharp and perfectly real, a reminder, of a kind, that she was still standing on the ground and not scattered across 3 miles of Mojave scrub. Somewhere behind her, mechanics were already tearing apart a broken jet, hunting for the flaw buried in its code. Tomorrow they would write a new checklist. They would try to translate what had happened in that simulator into something that could be taught, memorized, drilled into the next pilot who found himself locked in a spin with the ground coming up fast. They would try to turn 1 minute of instinct into 40 pages of procedure. But it wasn't magic, and it never had been. It was a machine, built by people, behaving exactly the way a frightened thing behaves when it doesn't trust what's holding the controls. For men had spent 2 hours trying to overpower it. It had taken one woman a single, unhesitating minute to simply stop fighting it, and let it go. She finished the cigarette down to the filter, ground it out under her boot heel, and looked out at the runway lights flickering on one by one against the darkening sky. Tomorrow there would be paperwork, debriefs, and men who still weren't sure whether to thank her or write her up. Tonight there was only the quiet, and the fact that David Cole was going to see another sunrise because someone had finally stopped fighting the machine and simply listened to what it was trying to say.